Hello, everyone. Good morning, maybe good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll let folks file in before we get started. If you wouldn't mind, as you're coming in, going to the chat and introducing yourself. What's your name? What's your title? What institution are you coming from? So go ahead, open the chat up and let's introduce ourselves. If you don't mind doing that as you file in, and we'll get started in just a moment once more attendees roll in. All right, thank you so much for joining today. The League of Innovation in the Community Colleges and Packback, talking today about evolving alongside artificial intelligence and more specifically, generative AI. If you're just coming in now, introduce yourself in the chat. And then also note that this will be recorded and the recording will be shared out later. And if you do have questions for the panelists, please put that in the Q&A function. So comments, chats, that can all be in the chat. And then questions that you'd like for the panelists go in the Q&A function. So without further ado, let's get started. I will be the host today, Kelsey Behringer, Chief Operating Officer over at Packback. My background is actually in the K-12 classroom. I was a high school chemistry and physics teacher for a few years before joining Packback, where I helped instructors implement Packback into their courses and have continued to work in that space, moving into the COO role in November. And I'm excited to be here. I've been, quite frankly, obsessed with ChatGPT ever since it's come out, and was just previously stating how exciting it's been to spend the past few weeks really digging back into teacher roots and having discussions about pedagogy and generative AI. With me today, I have Heather Olson, who will introduce herself in a moment, and Cynthia Wilson. So Heather, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Heather Olson. I'm the Director of Online Teaching and Learning Experience at Florida Southwestern State College in Fort Myers, Florida. And I've got a about 20-year background in teaching in English and psychology. I taught in K-12, and then I was faculty at Florida Southwestern for about 7 years. So, and like Kelsey, I'm obsessed with ChatGPT. I use it for everything, even determine whether or not I need to take a nap.
I love that so much. Yes, that is the best application I've heard thus far. And then Cynthia, do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Wilson. I'm Vice President for Learning and Chief Impact Officer at the League for Innovation in the Community College. I've been at the League for 24 years, so I've been doing this for a while. Before that, I was a faculty member. I started my career teaching in high school and then moved into a community college before I got the job I have now. So thank you, Kelsey.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for joining. I really, really appreciate it. And then thanks everyone who's attending this webinar today to hopefully have a really fun and insightful discussion about how we can evolve alongside AI. So for an agenda for today, we're going to get an introduction from Cynthia. Thank you so much. We're going to have a discussion about talking to our students about generative AI, teaching them the skills necessary to use generative AI well, some new assignment types that you can implement that actually require the use of generative AI. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time digging into some implications between generative AI and equity in education. So without further ado, Cynthia, would you mind sharing a brief introduction?
Thanks, Kelsey, and hi again, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our ChatGPT and Generative AI series. And the webinar is hosted, this series is hosted by the League and our good partners, Packback. The League for Innovation has served community colleges for 55 years. And during this time, part of what we've done is explored solutions to some of the most complex problems that your colleges face. We've also aimed to use our platform to give voice to many different perspectives. And then faculty, staff, and administrators examine those perspectives and ultimately innovate their approaches in ways that suit their particular needs. Today's session offers a distinctive perspective from Packback, a League partner. And while there'll be a brief mention of Packback's technology for supporting student success, I want to emphasize that the focus of today's session is on how we can evolve alongside generative AI and specifically technologies like ChatGPT. We all know that community college educators have a responsibility to prepare students for the workplace they will eventually enter. And in that workplace, effective use of generative AI may very well be a required skill, and maybe sooner than we think. Students who can effectively use generative AI will be the haves in that workplace, and those who were never taught how to use it will be the have-nots. We also understand the impact of inaction as it relates to modifying assignments, pedagogies, and practices in the rapidly changing world of technology. With generative AI and tools like ChatGPT, faculty are tasked with maintaining a healthy balance between teaching critical thinking and writing skills and honoring the technological literacy students must develop during their time in the classroom. I see this as an opportunity for innovation in teaching and learning. And what makes me optimistic is that community colleges are filled with innovators, open-minded, curious, and ready for change if that change means improving student success. So thank you all for joining us today as we explore ways to evolve and innovate alongside generative AI. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you so much for that. And as a reminder, this is the second in a series of webinars regarding generative AI hosted by Packback and the League for Innovation. So our next webinar will be on March 30th, same time on a Thursday, 11 a.m. Central Time, noon Eastern. And that's going to take a deeper dive into detection. So how can we fairly detect use of generative AI? How can we explore that? And then how do we facilitate conversations with students? So want to just start off with, if you're new to the generative AI space, and if you're here to learn more, just a quick 1 minute, what is ChatGPT? So if you're like me, you were introduced to ChatGPT because of this article right here from The Atlantic. What ChatGPT is a large language model. And the best way it's been described to me is really, really fancy autocomplete. You give it a question or you ask it for something and it'll give you an output, which is going to be written text. And it seems like there's a wizard on the other side of, the computer typing and giving you accurate information. It's almost like they're searching and they're presenting the research. It's not that. It's a statistical model. It is giving you the next likely word in a series of words. So a great example of, I think, demystifying generative AI has been some in the news recently. Google released their AI chatbot demo and there was a mistake in it. And what happened? Shares lost $100 billion, which is a little bit of an overreaction, but it is what it is. I think an even more hilarious example of, the realities of generative AI is the AI for, this is the Bing AI that was just released. Somebody asked who won the Super Bowl and it was just riddled with errors, right? The wrong winner, the wrong score, the wrong location, because it's not actually searching for truth. What it is searching for statistical likelihood. So we all just kind of need to keep this in mind. Now, if you have not yet used ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI and you are teaching, pull it up and use it today. Like before you go to sleep tonight, use ChatGPT, because at the end of the day, it is quite fun and it is really can feel magical at the end of the day. So in today's webinar, we're going to do something slightly different that we haven't done yet, which is poll throughout the webinar to get a little bit of feedback from the audience before we transition topics. So bear with us if it's a little bit of an experiment, but I'm going to launch a poll right now, which is, should we be talking to our students about generative AI? So you should see a prompt to answer this poll question. I'll leave it up for just probably like 30 to 60 seconds per poll. I love seeing these answers. I don't know, Heather, are you seeing the answers right now? Okay. See, we're experimenting here. I'll leave this up in for just a few more moments. All right. So I am so happy to see these results. I'll share them right now. We have 96% of attendees saying yes, and a few saying unsure. So what we're going to talk about is engaging in discussion with our students about generative AI. And before I share with Heather or have Heather share her story and her experience here, I want to just, introduce a concept of you can't play the game if you don't know the rules. And with our students right now, a lot of them probably understand that it's not exactly academically honest to copy and paste text from ChatGPT into an assignment and submit it as their own. But at the same time, if we're not incredibly explicit with them about what we expect, no use of generative AI, use generative AI in these settings. This is what you need to do if you are going to use generative AI. If we're not explicit about our expectations, they are going to fumble, and then they're going to be very upset if they're held accountable to a standard that was never communicated. So I think an immediate call to action for all of us in classrooms right now is just to make sure that we have communicated policies to students. It might be too late to change a syllabus, but it's never too late to send an email out or modify your assignment instructions to have a quick, AI syllabus policy. There's so many resources out there about really great policies. I found this one on Twitter. Would definitely recommend sharing your policies. Now, Heather and I were chatting, and Heather ran into I think her first AI detection a few weeks ago. And what started, or I should say what ended up happening is quite the story. So would you, Heather, share your experience with your first kind of detection instance and then what happened after that?
Sure. So full disclosure, I am a user of Packback and have been for a few years. So that's kind of where this came from. I went to one of Kelsey's webinars and they talked about Teach with GPT and the whole suite. And it just so happened that week I had a quiz due in Canvas that had some short responses. So in addition to my administrative role, I'm adjuncting and teaching a Literature 2000 class. And it really helps for me to teach an asynchronous online class to really inform what I'm doing in my full-time day job. So I was like, yeah, let me just check this out and get a little baseline. So what I was doing was taking one quiz response from each student and popping it into the AI generator checker in Teach with GPT. And they were all coming back, very low. And I was like, oh, good. My students are all doing their jobs. And then I read one and I'm like, nah, this doesn't sound right. And sure enough, popped it in. And it was high likelihood that it was AI generated text. So I was like, all right. And the great part about it is it gave me all of the reasons why. So I could easily communicate with the student. You've been flagged for AI generated text. Please come meet with me. Let's talk about it. It's a teachable moment. And then I keep reading, and then I found a second student. So I was like, oh, here we go. Then I got to the next quiz, and I found a student who not only used ChatGPT, but did not read before they copy and pasted. And in the midst of their response, it said, I am an AI generator and cannot, da, 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 da. So I'm like, all right, there's something going on here. So I went ahead and I wanted to know what my students thought about this technology. So I posted an open discussion in Packback and just said, hey, faculty are talking about this. I'm curious, what do you think of it? And I also included an article that said the headline was something along the lines of, is this the beginning or the end of, academia? And my students weighed in and they were very anti-AI generative text. And I was shocked. So that's kind of where this conversation with Kelsey started, as then Packback went in and took a look at some of my responses to see what students really had to say about using this technology. And here it is.
Yeah, these are some screenshots from that discussion. And I remember hearing about this through another team member. They reached out to me and said, you have to go look at Heather's Packback community. It's amazing. And it was really interesting to see, and Heather, you can speak to this a little bit, when you asked students what their perception was of generative AI and what they thought the implications would be for the future, a lot of students were able to just say, if I use generative AI as a crutch, I am going to get caught at some point. And not caught as in trouble, but like I am going to have not developed a skill I need to be a functioning student or human or communicator. Like they saw that this was going to have a downside for their own development if they were going to use this as a crutch. So that was like something that was so refreshing to read, I would say, as a former teacher, when students are making those connections. I don't know, Heather, if there were any other takeaways in the discussion or just about the experience that you'd like to share when you put the onus on your students to do this.
Well, and I think one of the most important takeaways for me as an instructor is, like everybody else, I had a little fear going in. My students are going to use this. I'm not going to see it. They're not going to master the content of my course. And that takes away the integrity of the entire thing. And what I liked about it is, after 20 years in the classroom, when I was reading, it was instantaneous. Within a sentence, I could say, that's not a student, that's a bot. That was very easy to differentiate. But then when I asked my students, hey, what do you think about this? This was an extra credit assignment. This was not required. It was extra credit. Over half of the class participated. And they went above and beyond with very detailed, very lengthy responses, as you could see. And it showed me that they cared. And I really like, on the one on the right-hand side of the screen, it said, my students said, I hope that moving forward, educational institutions are training their teachers and faculty on what to look for when it comes to this new technology. So they were really thinking about what this means for the future of their learning, as well as the future of education, and thinking critically about the implications. And that just, it really impressed me, and it gave me hope in education again. Not that I didn't have it, but it's always nice to get a little extra dose.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's just so nice when your students have like those like realization moments. It's just like the epitome of like driving intrinsic motivation, right? Like you could have forced the water down their throat, you know what I mean? But you brought them to the water and then you encouraged them to drink, right? And that's like just a master class, I think, in how to get students to develop their own relationship with like the rules, essentially. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, I think what is important is to understand that we are going to need to teach our students how to use generative AI. That is absolutely something that is in the future of education across all levels. And even, I would say, employers, right? I need to teach my team how to use generative AI in a way that I think will be effective and efficient. But I want to use an analogy here. I just started doing Pilates a few months ago. And if you don't know this about Pilates, they have made these machines called reformers, and they're very big and scary. They move, like one side of it doesn't move, the other side moves. There are springs. First time I got one on, it was like a, baby deer. But before I was able to get on that machine, I had to build up a couple of different foundational skills: core, balance, some strength skills. So I spent a few weeks on the ground, and then I was able to get on that machine. And I think it's important for us to think about generative AI as being a really cool tool that it does require some skills in order for that tool to be used well. So some of those skills include, but are not limited to, asking really good questions, because ultimately the quality of the output is reflective of the quality of the input. Verifying claims. That content in ChatGPT is not going to be accurate 100% of the time, right? We've seen that over and over again. So students need to understand how to verify claims. They actually needed to do that since the beginning of user-generated content. Editing text. I wouldn't edit anything unless I was forced to do it in class. And I finally was forced to do it in a English lit class in college. And then I learned how to edit because somebody sat down and made it a lesson, I think in 3 out of the 36 times we met. And then appropriate use of AI. So I think Heather had touched this, is, are they using it in a way that's academically honest or accidentally academically dishonest? So helping them understand what it means to use generative AI and still be academically honest. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can teach students these skills. Here's an example of just a couple of different lessons that I've seen implemented over the years. I've seen instructors require assignments that have students ask open-ended questions. I've seen instructors give students essay riddled with errors and they have to correct it, right? And then cite their sources. Editing, again, I had a class in college where an instructor sat us down. We thought the paper was due that day. It actually wasn't. He said, all right, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes editing and I'm going to walk you through the process. And it was the first time I was taught how to edit. So Heather, we had talked a little bit about this, instructors right now have so many things on their plate. They have a lot of content to, make sure that students understand. They have a lot of different assignments. And so there's this, I think for me, when I was teaching and there was something new, was, well, how can I incorporate this into my course? I already have so much on my plate. Like, I don't have time to dedicate, a lesson or a week to how to ask good questions. And as we were talking, this concept of scaffolding came up. So I want to just hear from you, how can we use strong scaffolding to actually implement teaching or practicing some of these skills alongside of our content?
Well, I think using strong scaffolding is the key to making sure students are practicing academic integrity, because if something is done step by step, they have all the tools to do it. There's no need for them to cheat. They don't go into that panic state. So it's taking content that you already have and then just organizing it differently. So one example we came up with in a workshop I was doing was for our nursing faculty. Students have to create patient care plans. Well, ChatGPT, we found out, can create an A+ patient care plan. So one way to start teaching students to create those is to actually use AI to generate a PCP, and then to have the students go back and explain why for each step. So you still have the same skill that students are mastering, but they're just mastering it in a different way, and they're scaffolding it. They can work forwards and then they can work backwards from there. So it's not a matter of changing your content. It's just a matter of going back, looking at the content and thinking, how can I reorganize this? As a composition instructor, I often tell students to flip their sentences. So they'll write a sentence and it's just not as fluent as it should be. I'll be like, just flip it, just take the end, make that the beginning and rewrite it. And it works every time. So sometimes with this AI generative text, we can use it to flip an assignment, to put it in a different way so that it is better scaffolded to prepare students to start with the end in mind, because they might actually be starting with the end.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, when students go to use generative AI, I think if they don't really understand how to ask a really good question or how to edit the output, they're just gonna, they're gonna be trying to use a hammer as a screwdriver, and they're gonna end up with a hole in the wall, right? So it's really important that they understand these pieces, they built these muscles before we send them to go use generative AI. So again, if you're excited by AI and you want to be using generative AI in your course, that's amazing. And that's a good gut reaction that we want to embrace it and not ban it. But at the same time, let's consider the skills they would really need in order to use it well. And then focus on incorporating those skills into your coursework, not necessarily the generative AI first, because that can follow, right? You can kind of build up to that over the time. So we'll pause here for another quick poll. I'm having so much fun with these. I realized I was still sharing the last poll. So let me open up our second poll, which is, which skills do you plan to explicitly teach your students or incorporate into instruction in the short term? So I'm going to go ahead and launch this now, and everyone should be able to hop. And this is a multi-select, so you can select asking good quality questions, verifying claims, editing, appropriate use of AI. I'll leave this up for about 60 seconds. I'll also share a quick story about asking good questions. I do this icebreaker with all of our new team members, because at Packback, we're all about inquiry-based learning, asking questions. We're, fearlessly curious is like our brand. So all of our new hires, I ask, all right, if you could have dinner with one person in the world, dead or alive, who would it be? Right. And everybody knows their answer pretty much right away. Rihanna is mine, always. And then I ask them, okay, you can only ask one question when you get to dinner, and that's it. That's the only conversation you're having, is you asking them one question and their answer. What's the question you're going to ask them? And then it always is like, this fun exercise of, it takes longer for them to answer that. They're like, oh, wait, no, if I ask this, then they're going to say that. No, and they really have to think about it. Like, what is the question I'm going to ask to get the most rich output? And it's an amazing icebreaker, so steal it if you'd like it, but it's also a great way to teach how to ask good questions, a really fun, quick exercise in the importance of asking good questions. So again, feel free to steal it at a dinner party and or in your classrooms. I'll go ahead and end this poll and share the results. It seems like asking good questions is definitely something we want to teach, verifying claims, appropriate use of AI. So interesting to hear these results. Thanks so much for engaging in that poll. All right, so let's talk about some new assignment types using generative AI, because I'm assuming there are a lot of people here and just a lot of folks and faculty that are interested in using generative AI in their courses. So wanted to highlight some great examples of using generative AI for existing assignments. This example right here is give students the end goal, right? So in your example, Heather, this patient care plan, and then have them try to find the best input or series of inputs to get the best output. And what you can have them do is actually document the process. Well, I asked this first and I noticed, it came back with something pretty generic. So then I asked it to do XYZ because ABC. They could just kind of document the thought process of changing their inputs along the way. The second is be the reviewer. So I love the idea of asking your students to use ChatGPT to write an essay, and then give your students your rubric that you use to grade essays and have them grade the essay, right? And they're like, yeah, this is a good one. And it's fun too, because then they understand. I think it always builds empathy when you ask them to grade something. Like, it's not very fun, is it? Well, it can be. But also you could pretend that you're a critic, right? You're a critic, you're, doing a peer review. I love the concept of outline building, both in ask ChatGPT to write the outline and then student writes paper, or student writes outline, gives it to ChatGPT, ChatGPT writes paper. So there are a lot of ways you can use generative AI for your assignments. And then Heather, something that we had actually talked a little bit about was thesis statements. You had been kind of thinking through how we can use generative AI for stronger thesis statements, correct? Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so again, I've been playing with ChatGPT professionally and personally because it's interesting to me. I like technology. And so one of the things that I was doing is looking at some of my feedback for my students on their writing and thinking, how can I use this to make it better? So before I got to the thesis statements, one of the other things I did is I took a student's entire essay and popped it in ChatGPT and said, what would you grade this? And ChatGPT informed me that, it was an AI generative text and could not grade. However, it would offer this feedback. And it gave me a list of beautiful, beautiful feedback statements that I could easily just copy and paste into my own grading process. However, the list of statements was not accurate to the essay I put in. So for instance, one statement said to improve this essay, the student would have to put a direct quote from the text in each paragraph. The student had done that. It was actually a solid essay. And so it was just giving me statistically what the most used feedback was rather than feedback to that statement. Or to that essay. So with thesis statements, I realized the same thing. So I can have a student put a thesis statement in there and say, how can I improve this thesis statement? And what ChatGPT is going to do is give it a list of the most common ways thesis statements can be improved. Those may or may not all apply to the thesis statement they put in. So that's where students have to think critically. And that's where they start to realize that it's a bot, not a human, that it's not particular to that statement. It's just giving them general ways to improve their thesis. So I think it's really helpful to have them use that and kind of critically think about what can make my thesis better and what is just statistically the most often thing stated about a thesis.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love the application too of like using GPT as a writing tutor, but you would have to teach your students how to use it as a writing tutor, right? Yeah. So it's like, you have to teach your student not to use, a hammer as a screwdriver.
If I could address and John's comment in the track, yeah, copying and pasting would definitely constitute plagiarism on the part of the professor instructor. I wasn't going to do that at all, but I just wanted to make the point of how eloquent and appropriate the comments that ChatGPT used were. They were comments based on other comments that professors have put in. So statistically, they were the most likely comments that professors would make. But no, I had no intention of copying and pasting this in. It was just a matter of kind of a little fact-finding mission.
I love that. And if you are unfamiliar with Packback, Packback is an AI-driven platform that does both discussion and writing. What we do though on Packback is we use artificial intelligence to teach the students to fish. We're not going to give them the fish. So we're using artificial intelligence to help them ask open-ended questions to improve their writing and mechanics. What we're doing essentially is using AI to build confidence and skills in students and then help instructors with some of the grading lift, right? Because at the end of the day, what I've found as an instructor is I have to grade a paper twice, once for grammar mechanics, then again for content. If we can take care of that first piece for you, we want to enable you as a content expert. Packback has used artificial intelligence to bring, students and instructors closer together for years, since 2015. And, you can see amazing results in your courses, more engagement, higher quality engagement as compared to a, learning management system discussion, and a higher rate of AEBs, A's and B's, and a lower rate of DWs and F's. Now, what I want to talk about in regards to Packback is actually something a little bit different than our core platform. Our Chief Technology Officer, Craig Booth, is a wonderful, innovative human. And what Craig saw with that Atlantic essay, right? The college essay is dead, was a reaction from education that we're in trouble. And he saw over the course of a few weeks, conversations around banning ChatGPT or shutting it down or detecting. And, that's natural. With any sort of new technology, we're going to have a little bit of fear of the implications before we enter the embrace phase. And then there's a phase of, oh, it's not as good as I thought it would be. And then we level out, right? There's a whole, journey we go through. But what Craig wanted to do was build something that was free, accessible to everyone, public, that would help instructors and students understand how to use generative AI as a superpower, and how to embrace it literally. So Craig, I think it was on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day or something, sat down and he built 4 tools. He built 4 tools, and they are now called something that is called Teach with GPT. Now, Teach with GPT is a free resource provided by Packback Labs, which is our incubation arm. So it's separate from our core platform and fundamentally very different. Our core platform, again, is more coaching students on how to write through more formal instruction. But Teach with GPT is truly, you can think of it as like Craig's fun experiment in our, just Packback's fun experiment. 4 unique tools that all use GPT, which is the large language model that powers ChatGPT. And I want to focus on 2 specific tools that I think are really amazing if you want to use generative AI in your class right now. The first is Fact Check the AI assignment generator. What this will do, and Heather's nodding because I think maybe you've used this already or played around with it. You can give it a prompt, and what our AI, Fact Check the AI, assignment generator will do is generate an essay with errors in it. You can then give that essay to your students and say, fact check it. We give you an answer key of exactly where the errors are, but what that is doing is giving them an understanding of, don't trust AI when it comes to fact, because there is no relationship with the truth. It has no relationship with the truth. It's not able to reason in the same way that a human brain can. But it's also teaching them that skill of claim verification. So definitely play around with that tool. We do have a detection tool in there. Play around with it if you need to. But the other tool I want to highlight is our course to career connector. And Heather, I think you can talk about this one a little bit. But what you can do is input your course and a career. And what this tool will do is basically help you come up with a bulleted list of why students should care about this course if they want to be in this career. So Heather, do you want to speak a little bit to the Teach with GPT tools that you've used?
Yeah, in Florida, most of us are moving towards guided pathways, which means we're having students kind of identify a track early on of what career they're going into. But as I taught academic success for 7 years, and I've taught composition and literature for a number of years, so I'm one that the students are like, I don't need this course. And that's where this can be really handy in something guided pathways, is you just put in the course, and then when you put it in, the student, and you put in the career the student's thinking of, and then they get a really nice generated response of why this is useful. And then this morning I was tinkering around because I was reading an article about ChatGPT making CVs. So I was like, oh, let's make myself a CV. So I put in my current title and said, generate a CV for this. And it came up with a lovely CV, none of which related to my job experience. And so it's another way to show students you could use those in tandem to have students create a resume for a job that they want, to get an idea of some of the skills that could be useful, but then also to see how certain classes are going to give them those skills that they need to put on their resume. So it's a great way to help students really have buy-in to their education and to have purpose to keep moving forward when things get a little bit hard.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that tool. If you're interested, again, if you're thinking, I would love to incorporate generative AI in my course, I don't really know where to start, I don't want to have to build something from scratch, go ahead, labs.packback.co, free to use. All you have to do is put in your name and email, and you get free access to all 4 tools. And there's a little video that will guide you through the 4 tools. This is an incredible resource if you just need a place to start. And if you need to thank someone for this resource, find Craig Booth on LinkedIn and send him a message. In fact, he would probably love if you just sent him your favorite emoji. That's a prompt that he likes quite often. But want to go ahead and pause here for a quick poll. I have a feeling I'm going to know the answer to this question here, but how likely are you to incorporate ChatGPT or other generative AI into an assignment or activity in your course? And I know every course is different. I taught chemistry and physics, and I could see it working in some perspectives, could see it not working in others. A few more answers. All right. A lot of very likelies and a lot of likelies, a few unlikely or very unlikely. I'm actually interested to hear for folks. Oh, always forget to share results. I'm interested to hear from folks who are feeling like they're not quite likely to be using generative AI or GPT in their courses. I'd love to hear in the chat, just, where's your head at? Is it that you're just waiting for like a few more assignments? Is it something that's just not applicable for your course? Or is it something that you have no interest in playing around with? But I'm intrigued to hear in the chat some examples of how you may or may not be bringing generative AI in the course room. So what I want to spend a bit of time discussing, and I would love to hear thoughts in the chat, and also if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A, is the concept of generative AI and equity. So I'm going to go ahead and brief this with, I am not an expert in equity or equity in education, but as a former teacher, something I was very passionate about was equity, and specifically just making sure students had equal access to success, essentially. And a couple of things come to mind when I'm thinking of generative AI and equity. And so first and foremost, consistent, free, high quality access to generative AI is not necessarily there right now. Students do have to pay, I think, $20 a month for ChatGPT Plus, which is how you gain access to the consistent high quality piece. We've all been there where we went to go use ChatGPT and it was, basically like, hey, capacity, we're at capacity, come back later. With this upgrade, you get basically consistent access. So as we're thinking about, should I assign generative AI to my students? Let's just make sure we feel confident in access, right? There are 2 other kind of things that come to mind for me when I'm thinking about generative AI and equity. And the first is we have high schools that are banning the use of ChatGPT. A high school down the street could be incorporating ChatGPT in every single unit lesson. At some point, every unit has an assignment that uses ChatGPT. So you have one student who is being trained on how to use this and a more effective user of generative AI. Another student who has never taught how to use it and doesn't know how to use it. That's where I see a gap forming, and that could have implications for their preparedness for college and their preparedness for careers. This other piece that kind of sits with me is, all right, so we teach our students how to use ChatGPT, generative AI. What happens to that student who uses it as a crutch and does not develop strong writing skills, and again is, at a disadvantage of their peer who, let's say, had an instructor who made sure that regardless of assignment, their students had to learn to really write and critically think and edit. So they're just like kind of, I have just a storm of, I think, thoughts in my head when it comes to generative AI and equity, and it's not all bad. So I want to say that. I kind of think of it as the good, and then the bad and the ugly. So Heather, I want to hear from you. When you're thinking of how we could how generative AI or other things around generative AI, the implications have potentially negative effects on equity initiatives. What are some of your thoughts? And then how do you think we could be mindful of preventing these kind of, I would say, negative implications?
I think the best way to prevent negative implications is not to make assumptions. So in the state college, or we call community colleges state colleges in Florida. It's a long, funny legislative conversation. But the state college that I teach at, we have 4 different campuses. And so my supervisor and I, because we're online, have been making an effort to work on a different campus frequently. So we went out to our kind of furthest out campus, which is Henry Glades, which is kind of the middle of nowhere in Florida. If you've been here, it's a beautiful farming community. But a lot of our students out there don't have access to Wi-Fi regularly at home, or Wi-Fi is in and out. So often on the weekend, students will park in the campus parking lot and use the Wi-Fi there to do their assignments, because that's going to be more reliable than their Wi-Fi at home. We need to be cognizant and not make the assumption that every student is going to have access to ChatGPT. If we're going to use it, we need to use it in a way that is deliberate and that it's equitably distributed amongst all of our students. I think that is really important going in. And that might mean using it more on the teaching side than on the learning side, because we may have access. And how can we use that? I read this morning that Khan Academy is using ChatGPT-4, and they're using it, or they're adopting it. They're starting to put it into their platform, or starting to look at how to use it. But their plan is to use it to tutor students and also to help teachers prepare better lessons. And I thought that was a very interesting way to go with it.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe it's not necessarily something we're going to put in front of students right away, but it is something you can use as an instructor if you have access, right? I think that's a great point. And I saw a question pop up that I'd love to answer. I honestly don't know the answer, so I'll give it a stab and then I'll see what Heather thinks. But do you think education will be able to keep pace with AI evolution? For example, GPT-4 was just released. Previous iteration passed the bar exam in the bottom 10%, where the new iteration has now passed the bar exam, scoring in the top 10%. Yeah, so that's the thing about technology, is it really is exponential. And I would argue, and I think Heather's discussed this and we'll probably speak to this, that we're already behind in a lot of ways when it comes to education and technology. So, I think from my perspective, I wouldn't set an expectation for myself if I was still teaching a classroom to always be ahead of the game, or even, at the, the top of the curve, or, the right side of the bell graph. I think what I would try to do is, I taught high school, take one assignment per unit and try to incorporate generative AI, and probably dedicate, 1 day a week to listening to a podcast about generative AI, so that at least I can stay an informed consumer. I think I would approach it with bite-sized pieces, because I think if your goal is to constantly try to stay, with the curve, you're going to end up probably deprioritizing things that you really need to do, which is like, I had to really convince my students to love chemistry and physics. Like, that was the first thing I had to do. It wasn't even about teaching them. It was about how can I convince them to come on this journey with me. But I would recommend bite-sized pieces. So 1 assignment per unit would probably be my goal. 1 podcast per week would be my goal. And then I think too, like putting your assignments in GPT-4 and just seeing what the output is. And if the output's really good, with a small tweak you can make to that assignment, or a small tweak you can make to the way that you communicate that assignment. I know, Heather, what your thoughts are with kind of keeping up with the exponential curve of AI.
I think it's like keeping up with the curve of everything. I got a new car recently, and my old car, you had to press a button to start it. And my new car, you just get in it and it starts. And over this last week, I'm on spring break, so I went to St. Thomas for a family trip and ended up being the family driver. And the rental car, you had to put a key in and turn it. I was like, whoa. And almost every time I get in the car, I'd get in and I'd set the key in the cup holder. But I try to start the car and I'm like, it's not going anywhere. And everybody laughs the whole time. But I think it's kind of similar to that. I can operate all modalities of car, whether it starts when I get in, or I press the button, or I turn the key. But it's moving forward and realizing that it can be easier just to kind of go with the flow of it. I don't want to go back to having to crank my car to start it. And so the same thing with this, to ignore it, to ban it, is going back to the hand crank. To keep going with it is to go with the push button start and the get in and start. And so I think it is important to be cognizant of it. And again, just try it in your daily life. That's how I started it. One of my favorite uses of it right now is to generate titles. I have it generate 10 to 20 titles, and then I, look at those and choose what I like and combine 5 of them. And it's a whole editing revision process in itself. I also use it for outcomes. I do a lot of workshops. I do a lot of QM design with learning. So I'm like, hey, give me 20 outcomes. And I look at 20 outcomes, and out of those, I compose 3 to 5. And so it's having it do kind of that heavy lifting that's going to make it easier. There are parts of it that scare me. I like reading about it in the morning. So a good little morning newsletter will have a mention of it. So this morning I found out that Duolingo is using GPT-4 and Khan Academy is. I also found out, and this is frightening as a social scientist, that GPT-4 has the capability of coding qualitative data. And that frightened me because as a social scientist, that's what I do. I love coding data. So for me, coding data, when I get in there and read every single word somebody said, that's how I really truly understand what it is I'm studying. And I'm like, if I let ChatGPT do that for me, am I going to understand it? And that's a question I have to ask because other social scientists are already doing that. And so, it's really a matter of looking and seeing where it's being used, how it's being used, and then finding out where you're most comfortable with it. Will I be popping some data in there next week and letting it code for me? Yes. Will I do that the next time I'm doing a study? Maybe not. But it's a matter of just trying it and seeing, does this work? Doesn't this work? Who else is using it? What are they using it for? And making sure, especially in the public education sector, that we're not sending our students to other places, that we're keeping up with the Khan Academies and the Duolingos of the world and teaching students what they need to be competitive in the job industry, where they're going to be working for places like Packback and Khan Academy and Duolingo. And right now I saw that they're using generative AI also for stock picks. They're going to be working in finance. All of these places are going to need it. So how do we introduce it to students in a way that it's familiar to them and that it's not something that they're going to be frightened of or have a negative connotation for?
Absolutely. There's a good question in the chat. Do you have podcast recommendations? So it's a little bit old, but there's an amazing As Recline podcast on artificial intelligence that kind of walks through, I think, some of the more philosophical questions and implications of AI, but it's a great place to start. And then if anybody else has recommendations for podcasts, articles, I know there's no shortage of discussions about generative AI right now. So As Recline has been a great podcast that I loved. Ezra Klein, I think it's New York Times podcast he does. And I'm trying to think when it aired. It must have been in February. I can try to find it, but if you just Google Ezra Klein, New York Times AI podcast, it's I can't remember what the podcast is called, but it was maybe back in early February. It was a really good session. Yeah. Any other recommendations for podcasts or articles, feel free to throw it in the chat. This is definitely a crowdsourcing moment if there ever was one. Well, we've talked a little bit about, I think, the implications of how moving too slow with generative AI could have some negative impacts on equity. Moving too fast, same way, right? If we just are all right, all of my assignments are on ChatGPT now, I'm never going to have students write again. We're probably going to have a student with underdeveloped communication skills, right? Or underdeveloped critical thinking skills. So meeting in the middle, somewhere in that middle, I think is where we are preventing some of the downfall of generative AI and equity in education. Now, I don't want to be all negative here. I want to end on a positive note, right? I want to be optimistic here. So what are some ways that we think generative AI can be used as a tool for equity initiatives? So Heather, I want to hear some of your thoughts on how could students or instructors or institutions be using generative AI to help students and instead of widen the gap, let's say, make that gap much more narrow?
Yeah, I want to start by addressing a comment in the chat about there being a large racial bias response when using ChatGPT. Looking at this from the narrow lens of the United States of America, I would be remiss to not say that there's a large racial bias in just about everything. It's the nature of this country. Look at anything happening here, there's a large racial bias. I think as an educator that I can definitely use this as a tool for equity in terms of students coming from underrepresented or marginalized populations who haven't had equal access to education. In the area where I live, students are often treated differently in the classroom. There's an unconscious bias that affects every single moment of their experience in the classroom up until college and through college. So if I can use generative AI, something like Packback, as a tool to give every single one of my students a personalized coach that's going to help them write on a college level, that's going to help them to think critically, to be more curious, that is the best thing that I can possibly do for equity. And again, this is something to be very cognizant of. This is something to definitely watch. Because when you look at the statistics of our country and you look at the creators of technology like this, you're looking at a very homogenous group of people. And so that's going to feed into what the tool does. So using the, regardless of where the tool is coming from, using it for good can be a way to really distribute that equity in an equitable way.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember the precise example, but I think it's important to know that like ChatGPT is using the data that it was trained on, and majority of the data is biased, right? It speaks with a bias. So if we're aware of that, awesome. We can even name it to students, or we could have students try to find examples of bias in generative AI, right? There was a really great example, and I don't actually think it was GPT. I think it was Google Translator. Somebody had put in some text that uses gender neutral, I think pronouns, you know, in Spanish, it's él or la, it was kind of gender neutral terms. And it said like, they wash the dishes, they go to work. And when Google translated it into English, it said, she washes the dishes, he goes to work. So generative AI has a ton of biases, just based off the fact that it's trained on data that is biased. And the more that we can, I think, discuss implications of that, and then think through like, what is this potentially doing to my student? Is it harmful or is it helpful? That's the implication, right? So nothing's going to be perfect, certainly not generative AI for many, many reasons. But if we can be mindful before we're inputting policies, before we're creating assignments, I think we're going to probably do much better for our students. And then Heather, there was a question that came in the Q&A, which was, can you explain how you use ChatGPT for titles? My students typically have issues coming up with a title for their essay.
It's really fun. And I'll tell you too, this is a great way with writing to get students excited about writing. So let's say I have students writing an essay about a book they just read. They actually just did the play Rhinoceros. And so I would say, come up with a funny title about rhinoceros and fear. And then I like using the word funny because I do like funny things, but I've also used the word creative and specifying it that way. And then I'll just say, instead of a title, I'll have it come up with 20 titles. And then again, that's where you've got the human versus the AI. I typically don't use any title as it is. I look at 20 titles. That's kind of like my brainstorm. But instead of spending 10 minutes brainstorming and writing a bunch of words in a word cloud and then looking at all of that, I spend 30 seconds in putting it into ChatGPT, and then I just pick what I like and put it together the way I want to. And so it's really easy to do. And again, that can be a great way for students to help to focus their writing. If they put what they're writing about and say, come up with a title for, you know, a paper on the biased nature of AI generators or something like that, you know, it'd be interesting to see what they come up with. Anybody's welcome to do that now. Put it in the chat.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, any other final thoughts on, you know, if instructors want to be mindful of equity and how they can use this as a tool for equity initiatives? Any final thoughts there, or just maybe closing statements in general from you, Heather?
Yeah, I would say, you know, the biggest thing is there's a positive psychologist his name is Sean Aker, who I really like, and he does a great TED Talk. And in his TED Talk, he talks about one of the challenges with education is that educators tend to teach to the average. You have the outliers up here, and then you have the outliers down there, and we're teaching to someplace in the middle. But if we do that, what we're doing is we're only bringing the ones up here to the middle, and then we're taking the ones up here, we're bringing them down to the middle. So teach to the excellent, keep your expectations, keep your standards high. In terms of AI, teach students to where you want them to be. Don't teach them to where they are, because that's how we're all going to keep moving up together. Don't be afraid of new things, embrace change, embrace being wrong, fail fast and move forward with AI. I think is the best thing that we can model for our students and teach them as they move on into the workforce.
I'm going to steal that phrase from you, fail fast and move forward. Well, if you are interested in the next webinar in this series, will really focus on detection and having conversations with students and kind of demystifying detection and having a deeper conversation on what the reality of AI detection is right now and will always be. You can find that on our Packback webinars page. Also, the League for Innovation should also have the sign up for that. I'm saying maybe if my colleague Taylor can move really quickly and input the link to that next webinar, he's on it. And if you are interested in learning more about Packback, Heather has used Packback at our institution for quite some time. It's a really great tool. I mean, it's the reason why I joined the company and left teaching is I wanted to broaden my impact, and specifically as it related to inquiry-based discussion and inquiry-based learning. You can email one of our team members at curious@packback.co, or simply go to our Packback Labs website and play around and experiment with that tool a little bit. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you for answering those polls. There'll be a short survey as I end the webinar, just to kind of get some thoughts. They're really, really helpful as we're thinking of content and what to do next here. And then Heather, thank you so much. It's always so wonderful to see you and chat with you. And you're just such a great instructor and educator and human being. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun. I can't believe an hour went by that fast.
Right? It's amazing. We'll have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thanks for joining. And I look forward to seeing some familiar names and faces in about 2 weeks. Have a good one.